Hello, everybody. First off, thanks to Security Bricks for the fiesta out there. Hoping everybody's ready for some CMMC information instead of a siesta. So, let's see, where are we? All right, so today we're going to talk about CMMC scoping. And we've talked about that a little bit before. Joy talked about, mentioned it in brief. What scoping really is about is drawing a line around your CMMC compliance area. Ultimately, what you're doing by defining a scope is you're telling the assessor what should be assessed. We'll talk about why that ends up being really, really important. You see up here my little AI-generated graphic. Think about the scope as something that defines the boundary. So oftentimes we'll talk about these terms sort of interchangeably. But we've got different asset categories that need to be considered. And the idea here is, you think about this, security in a lot of respects has been a military thing throughout history, right? And you think about walls that keep bad guys out, and you keep your important, valuable stuff inside. So when I think about the scope, and I think about defining the boundary, that's what I think about is how do I build that wall to make sure that I keep my assets and all of these things that are important to me, how do I keep that safe? And then ultimately the assessor is going to come in and say, how good a job are you doing at keeping those things safe? An assessor in general is not going to be evaluating your scope. They're trusting you to do that right. And so that's why this ends up being super duper important. If you end up not doing it right, there's a problem. It ends up creating kind of other problems later. Okay? Two other pieces of information. One is I gave this talk last week at CS5 in Washington, D.C. So many friendly faces took a cross-country flight to come out here and visit you all. I actually live in Black Diamond, so I just drove up today. And then also by a little bit way of additional information is that I do compliance work now, but my background is really in engineering. So I really have been in this industry for about 40 years, I realized recently. I have a bigger belly now and more gray hair, and I started young. But when I started with all this stuff, there really was no such thing as cybersecurity. And I think it's important for us to recognize that CMMC is really driving people to solve a long-standing hard problem. Across my entire career, organizations have struggled to secure their environment. Realistically, they've struggled to run their computer systems very well at all. I ended up getting into cybersecurity mostly because I cared about enterprise architecture, which is about making sure that the business is well supported by the computing environment. So I want to note to you all that CMMC is interesting now because it's something that is driving activity. But ultimately, if the computers don't actually support what people are trying to do with them, then that means that people end up having the computers almost for the sake of their own magnificence. And computers are not magnificent. They're cool, but they're not magnificent. We need to make sure that the technology is actually supporting what people want to do. And there's a lot of subtlety with that. And one of the things that shows up in that subtlety is CMMC scope. Okay? All right. So what is scoping? Actually, this is a little bit hard to read. So we talked before about the bottom line up front is this is what you're telling the assessor to assess, right? We need to understand how CUI enters the organization. Tell you what, I'm going to do this. How it enters the organization, what you do with it, where it goes, and all of that. Sometimes it's easier to figure out where CUI is not within an organization. So we're going to talk a little bit about enclaving My friends over there at Security Bricks did advocate enclaves. I'm a fan of enclaves, but it doesn't always work in every situation. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. And we also need to recognize that this isn't just IT. So many times CMMC just gets handed off to the IT department, says, well, go figure this out. Well, not only, as we have already established, not only do IT people not really know how to document very well, speaking from personal experience, I've had to get better at it, but they're almost never thinking in terms of business process. So make no mistake, CMMC is a business process problem that happens to have a technical computing component to it. But we also need to recognize that there's people involved, there's buildings, there's paper, and most of this is process. So when we talk about the documentation, again, the documentation does not exist for its own magnificence. The documentation is there to make sure that we've written down what we're supposed to be doing. And then, of course, the assessors are going to come in and say, okay, you wrote this down, now are you actually doing it? Okay. So when we talk about scoping, we need to think about the kinds of assets that are defined within the scoping guide. So a CUI asset is defined as something that stores, processes, or transmits CUI. Okay? In the PCI world, which is related to credit card numbers, one of the things that happens a lot is to think about the data like a contagion, like Ebola. That anywhere that it goes, it kind of ends up being like a contaminant. Now, of course, it's not that bad, right? But the point is that we need to understand where the data is going, and anywhere that it's touched needs to be protected. So like with Ebola, you wouldn't just want to open up a vial of it right here and start waving it around. You'd want to have it in a containment facility that's specially built to protect this data, right? Protect the virus. And so when you're talking about a CUI asset, that's anywhere that it goes, okay? Then there's the security protection asset. That's the stuff that actually provides the security for the CUI assets. So if we talk about like a biohazard environment, that's going to be the buildings and walls and all that, but it's going to be the ventilation and also, you know, some of the processes. So when we talk about security protection assets in a CMMC context, we're talking about things like Entra ID, a SIM, antivirus, vuln scanning, those kinds of things. Okay, firewalls. So anything that provides security capability for the CMMC program. A specialized asset ends up being kind of oddball stuff. Sometimes you'll have a CNC machine that'll be run by a Windows XP box that can't be secured. You can have some IoT. So it's a specialized asset is anything that has CUI on it that can't actually be secured to a standard. Okay? A contractor risk managed asset is something that could have CUI on it, but isn't meant to. Okay? So oftentimes run into this maybe with an HR workstation, where the HR person isn't working with CUI, but has a workstation that's on the same network. Okay? And so unless a device is logically or physically isolated from a CUI asset, like for example, we talk about logical isolation, that means across a firewall boundary. Okay? So if the HR workstation is on the same network as a CUI asset, if it's not meant to have CUI on it, then it can be a contractor risk managed asset, a CRMA. The thing about that is that a CRMA is meant to be configured to the same standard as a CUI asset. It's just one of those things that an assessor is going to go, Yep, okay, and set it aside. And then an out-of-scope asset is stuff that can't process, store, or transmit CUI, isn't a security protection, isn't any one of these other things, and it needs to be logically or physically isolated. Okay? So if we go back here, you see out of scope, that's outside of the boundary. It's outside of the walls. Because it's physically isolated. And in terms of scope assets, that means that at some level we don't care as much from a security or compliance perspective if a bad guy gets it. We don't care in the same way. Okay? So here's an example scope. So you see here that there's the entire scope can have the contractor here, and we'll frequently color code these things. So in this case, the CUI assets are blue, the security protection assets are purple. And this is really a best practice to color code these things when you create a boundary diagram. It ends up making it a lot easier for an assessor to come in and figure out what is going on in the environment at a glance. We'll see over here on the left, we have out-of-scope assets, and they're separated by a firewall boundary, so that's the logical isolation. But we also need to recognize that there's an external service provider. We chatted a little bit about those earlier. An external service provider might be an MSP, an MSSP, something like that, that is helping to run an organization's environment, but is an outside organization. And Compliance IT is an MSP, so we fall into this external service provider area. Okay. So in terms of steps to scope your boundary, the first thing is to identify what do you have in your environment. So who are your people? What are the technologies? What are the facilities? Get your arms around everything that's inside of your company. If you're talking about, this by the way gets a little bit tricky if you're talking about joint ventures, subcontractors, all of that. I'm not going to go into some of those subtleties now. I'll talk with you about that offline. But ultimately the idea is to, well, CMMC, you're certifying an organization based on cage code. Okay, so if you're talking about another cage code, that's outside of scope by definition. Even if that other cage code might need to get CMMC certified as well. So step 2 is to categorize all your assets. So understand what these are within your environment. So what's a CUI asset? What's a specialized asset? And then create a diagram of what it looks like. Now, that's not technically required for the assessment, but gosh darn it, it's really, really helpful. Not only to help the assessors, but to help you understand how all this stuff fits together. Step 4 is we're defining the external and cloud service providers. To be really clear, all CSPs are ESPs, all cloud service providers are external service providers. But the reverse is not true. Not all external service providers are cloud service providers. I'm not going to drain that, but yeah, some people are laughing. There's some subtlety around that. We've in the community, we've talked about this for hours. The big thing is that a cloud service provider, if you're talking about a cloud like Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, those kinds of things, you need the FedRAMP version. Anytime you've got CUI in a cloud, it needs to be FedRAMP moderate equivalent or better. Then step 5 is you're mapping the data flows and the data management. So understanding, you're getting your arms around all that. Now where does the data go? Then we're also diagramming the logical network and the physical boundaries, and that ends up being the assessment scope, either the entire enterprise or an enclave. Well, why does this matter? Well, we need to include a lot of stuff in the scope. So we need to include all the stuff that's stored or processing or transmitting CUI and everything that supports those processes. The security tools, those are the security protection assets. The more stuff there is, the more complex this can get. So the more physical locations, the more systems and all that. I have a client right now that has at least, well, CUI in at least 5 cloud services, 3 of which are not FedRAMPed. We're having some conversations about what to do about that. But this is where the complexity can come in. There is a lot of it depends in this. So some organizations are really straightforward, and if you are, God bless you, you'll have a relatively straightforward time towards compliance. But there ends up being a lot of different subtleties. And this is part of the reason why so many organizations engage consultants. I kind of think of this at the beginning stages that we're at right now as being almost like the first time that anybody has filed a tax return. I don't know about you all, like I can't figure out those forms. I just do TurboTax, even though my taxes aren't that complicated. I just went next. Need expertise behind that in order to make it simple. That's my job and jobs of many of the people in this room. Because of the it depends, this is where consultants can be helpful. I'm not saying you have to have it, but this is where, if you're not sure about those steps, ask for help, because it's super easy to run off into a ditch. Like, super easy. And the reason for this is that the scoping has to be right. If you mess it up, it puts contract at risk. And we talked, a little bit earlier about the False Claims Act. The Department of Justice is going to be watching people, and people that make incorrect statements are potentially going to find themselves liable. Now, I don't get the impression that the DOJ is going to be on the warpath. They don't want to put anybody out of business. But considering that CMMC has come along because of a substantial level of non-compliance, they're going to be watching a lot more closely. Now, one last thing about the False Claims Act is I was talking last week with Eric Crusius, which is a name that some of you might know. He's a good friend and really prominent sort of lawyer in the CMMC space. I asked him specifically about False Claims Act and the potential liability. What he says is that the DOJ is really only interested in people that knowingly make false claims, so knowingly submit an incorrect score. But then I asked, well, how knowingly is knowingly? Like, I asked the question earlier about like how trustworthy is the SPRS score? There are a lot of people that have submitted incorrect SPRS scores. And he says, well, we'll all just have to see. So the point is, understand what it is and work hard on doing it right. Okay, because the days of going 140 miles an hour in a 55 zone are over. The cops are out, and you're not necessarily going to get pulled over every time you go 10 over, but you are running a risk. Okay? So let's go back and talk about the data flows. Now this is a bit hard to read. I'm hoping that you can check this out at your leisure offline. But what we've got here is 4 different swim lanes. Essentially at the top, this is where data is coming in from. So this is going to be an organization's customers, the Department of Defense, and all that. In general, what we do is have it come into a contracting. This is typical, but doesn't necessarily have to reflect every organization. But oftentimes I see it coming into a contracting department where a CUI person, somebody that understands the contracts, can evaluate the data as it comes in and says, well, is this CUI? Is this FCI? Is it? Oh yeah, that does look like CUI. Okay, it is. So what are the rules that I'm going to apply to this? Who's going to have access to it? What are the conditions under which they can have access to it? We need to understand that CUI can only be accessed by somebody with what's called a lawful government purpose. What's that? Essentially, that's a need to know. And so what that means is that some organizations will say, well, everybody needs to know all information. Everybody needs access to all the CUI. Like, really? Are you sure? Like, I had a client like that. It was a manufacturing company. And they said, yeah, everybody needs access to everything. I said, well, you're saying that the people on your factory floor need access to your contracts? Well, no. I said, well, that's not everything, is it? So it's important to do that kind of segmentation. And that's what we're talking about there, is to understand what it is and who's going to have access to it. Then we apply CUI marking to it. And there's a whole thing about the way that CUI needs to be marked. Okay? Both physical documents and also the logical documents, so Word documents, Excel, and all of that. There's guidance on the DoD website about how to do that. Up at the top, we'll have kind of an external CUI sharing process, which, by the way, has to include vetting of the people that are going to be receiving that data. Before you can just hand it over to them, you need to make sure that they are qualified to receive it. That's your responsibility as somebody that's received the CUI. In here, we have a paper CUI process. And I'll say that I see a lot of organizations working to eliminate paper to the extent possible, because you have to protect it, you have to lock it up, keys, those kinds of things, you have to shred it. Not sure if everybody knows, but when you destroy paper CUI, it needs to be shredded down to 1 millimeter by 5 millimeter particles. And then also dealing with printers is a huge pain in the rear. Huge. So see a lot of organizations trying to get rid of paper. And then we also have a digital CUI process here where people receive access to the CUI. This can get a little bit tricky when an organization is generating derivative CUI products. So like maybe they get a specification in and then they're creating a CAD diagram from that specification. That diagram is also CUI and needs to be marked and handled accordingly. Okay? And then down here, we have another swim lane for the external organizations. So this is where we're talking about sort of the vetting and all of that. As a security guy, it makes me, quite honestly, a little bit nervous to just hand over data to somebody not knowing exactly how they're going to handle it. From a compliance perspective, again, our requirement is to vet them and make sure that they are capable of adequately handling it. And then we can hand it over. In general, our responsibility ends at that point unless you have reason to believe that they are mishandling it. And if you have reason to believe that they're mishandling it, then you do have a responsibility as somebody that hired them. You do have the responsibility to follow up on that. The way that the DoD is saying it is, you hire them, it's your responsibility. So I'm going to talk about enclaving a bit. So this is something that in the CMMC space we've been talking about, going back and forth on for years. And we've been talking about it in the security space for years as well. Now, what is an enclave? Essentially, an enclave is an environment that is physically or logically isolated from something else. Kind of think about it like, I don't know, up here we've got ADUs, you know, people like turning their garages into areas that they can rent out on Airbnb. That would be like an enclave. It's kind of on my property, but it's separate, right? Another way to think about it would be like a safe room in your house, where you have additional security protections. The assessors tend to like enclaves because, like we heard, they're simpler to assess. There's less going on. So reason to enclave. One is the existing IT environment is just terrible and you have to do something right now. So like I mentioned, my client with the 5 SaaS products, many of which aren't FedRAMPed. They asked me last week, well, what can we do by November 10th? I'm like, you can't. You're just stuck. I said, if we go real hard, real fast, maybe you'll be compliant by June or July of next year. We heard before that typically most organizations will spend 12 to 18 months. So one of the things I've talked about in the CMMC space is I kind of think about CMMC like a hurricane. I grew up in South Florida. And this time of year, when you see a wave come, like there's that category 5 that's about to hit Jamaica. It's real bad. When you see the hurricane coming, there's some people that go out, they go to Publix, they get bottled water, they get canned ravioli, put up their hurricane shutters, and then other people go out and get a keg of Budweiser. And they say, nah, we're going to be fine. And it's really, really, really sad when those people with the Budweiser call up drunk, say, the water's rising. They call up the police and say, the water's rising. I need for you to come get me. It's too late. So the hurricane is here. It's been approaching for years. And so not everybody is going to make it. But that doesn't mean that it's too late for everybody. And going out and getting the bottled water and preparing now makes sense. So an enclave is one of the ways that can be done. You can do this more quickly. Okay? Another thing is you're a big company and there's no way that everything can be in scope. So you're a Lockheed Martin, a Boeing, L3 Harris, something like that. And it makes sense to have a separate environment. In fact, those organizations oftentimes have multiple enclaves. Another reason is that you've got a small number or percentage of users that are working with CUI. So maybe you're 20% Department of Defense work, and you've got a whole bunch of other stuff. It's just kind of intermingled. And you don't want to have everybody get vetted for CUI. They don't have a lawful government purpose. So having that separated off can make sense. Another thing is that you have maybe a really capable IT department that can run multiple computing environments. Because you need to recognize that if we're talking about an enclave, it doesn't mean that your existing environment went away. You've now got another computing environment. So that's kind of like having two cars. So twice the oil changes, twice the tires, those kinds of things. We need to make sure that the business processes, and this is a key one, business processes can support controlled data isolation without a productivity hit. This, in my experience, is kind of the swing point on enclaving. I've seen many, many circumstances where people go, well, I want to have an enclave, but if I do it, I'm going to break stuff. So worked with a manufacturer that makes computer motherboards. And they had a huge assembly line, $100 million assembly line, that was run by an ERP system that all the components and all these sorts of things and did the automated manufacturing. There was no way that they could separate off the jobs that they were doing for the Navy, for example, into a different assembly line. There's no way that they could have a different ERP, like it would break stuff. So there was no way that they could enclave. Another thing is that the users work either only with controlled data or only with uncontrolled data. So that means that if they're working with controlled data, the CUI, the FCI, it's over here. Other people are over there, that you have a clear delineation. If you have people going back and forth, it becomes more challenging. And then the last point is that, hey, maybe you just don't want to buy relatively expensive SaaS licenses for everybody. The big complaint there is Microsoft 365 with their GCC High. Personally, I think that the cost of those licenses is worth it, even though it's substantially more than commercial. I'll just say, personally, in my experience, that software is in 99.9% of situations less expensive than human beings. And so it can be worth it. But if you're talking about just, say, 20 people in a 20,000 person organization is working with CUI, then it doesn't make sense to migrate everybody over to GCCI. It doesn't make sense to buy those licenses for everybody. So that's why to Enclave. Why not to Enclave? They can cost a little bit less to implement and certify, but the multiple computing environments are definitely more expensive in the long run. So less expensive for certification, more expensive for operations. Small companies frequently struggle to run just one computing environment, let alone multiple. This is the reason why I have a job, is working for an MSP. And we said before that this has been a hard problem. So adding more complexity on top of the existing complexity to fix a complex situation isn't necessarily the right thing. Also, another thing to consider is that companies need to secure their own data as well. So CMMC is being driven by the Department of Defense. We're starting to see it with Department of Energy, NASA, and all of that. But just because the government says that they want you to secure their data doesn't mean that it's not valuable to secure your own data. So the way I think about this and the way I position it to CEOs is, all right, you don't want to spend the money on this stuff. I get it. You regard this as a tax. Fine. Wouldn't it be nice to get some value for your tax? Like, if you're going to go to all this trouble and spend all this money creating a secure environment, why would you willfully exclude your own data? That kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So what I've seen is that oftentimes an organization maybe can spend an extra 15 or 20% and just secure their entire environment. We talked before about breaking business processes. The last reason to not enclave is that your contracting officer doesn't support it. Contracting officer kind of rules all. I haven't seen that yet, but they can do it. All right, so let's talk about a couple of for instances. So this is a multinational engineering firm, 100-person US-based company with international presence. They're about 70% commercial and 30% defense. The contracts are calling for the protection of the CUI. This is super interesting. It's the first time I've heard this. We're going through their contracts because I asked them what category of CUI they had. And since they're an engineering firm, I assumed that it was decrypt. For those of you that know, that's basically plans for like military bases. We went through their contracts and found that there was CTI in there and also some privacy. Like, okay, they didn't know that though. But what they said is that their DoD contacts told them to ignore the DFARS clauses requiring them to protect their CUI. Yeah, you're over there. Wow. What? Yeah, I said, it's inconvenient for us, the DoD people. I said, just ignore that. Doesn't matter. I said, did you get that in writing? No. I said, well, sorry, they didn't excuse you. They also, by the way, said, wow, this is really unfair. How could they just drop this on us? I said, well, you've had at least 5 years of warning. So, sorry. So in this case, the CUI is intermixed with uncontrolled data. Well, geez, if they don't even know what the CUI is, you kind of imagine. The computing environment is very diverse. So security, protection, assets, process, and documentation are incomplete. So they submitted an SPRS score, but don't have an SSP. You don't actually get to do that. You need to have an SSP before you can submit an SPRS score. And we talked about the CUI is stored in a mix of SAS. They considered an enclave because fixing the current computing environment is going to require a lot of work. So moving that data out of a commercial SaaS into a FedRAMP SaaS is non-trivial, especially if they got a bunch. They also don't have, like I said, every security protection asset that they're supposed to have. The IT team is very limited. There's 2 people, and they're very sweet, but there are a lot of things that they don't know. And this is, again, that organization that said, hey, what can I do by November 10th? I'm like, nothing. You're stuck. So if we try real hard, we'll get there by August, June. So they rejected that, said, well, they wanted to secure their entire environment because isolating the CUI will break their business processes. And also they said, well, again, they came up with this on their own. I couldn't hug them. Said, well, if we're going to go all this trouble, we just want to secure the entire environment. They're actually reconsidering now as of last Wednesday. Said, well, if it's going to take that long and we're going to be at risk, maybe we really do want to do an enclave, at least as a stopgap. And so we'll see how that goes. This is a different kind of manufacturing firm, 100-person company. They're basically making widgets. So they've got like CNC machines and all that. This is the kind of the opposite in some respects of the previous organization that was creating intellectual property. These guys are actually manufacturing things. So they're taking Prime's drawings, creating G-code. G-code is basically the way that you program a CNC machine. People know what a CNC machine is? It's basically a computerized milling machine. We have a lot of that in this area, especially like with Boeing. And so the widgets and the associated technical data are classified as ITAR and CUI. Now, by the way, just as a quick aside, the widget itself, if it was generated under ITAR, which is about, it's an export restriction on weapons. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but that's a Department of State regulation. CMMC is a DoD regulation, right? So they kind of converge, but they're not the same thing. The widget would actually be regulated under ITAR, the thing itself, but the physical thing itself is not regulated under CMMC. It's regulated under other stuff, but not under CMMC. CMMC is only for data. If it's on a computer, whether it's on a computer or on paper. Okay, so these people are doing 40% DOW, DOD, 60% commercial. So it made sense for these people to actually set up and do an enclave. Okay, because it's a relatively restricted number of people, and they could have it in a restricted area within their environment, within their manufacturing environment. And so that way they could physically and logically isolate it off. Was actually going to go through and do some live scoping, move these icons around. I don't have access to the computer, plus I'm running short on time. So I'm going to skip over this. We can talk about this offline if you like. But what I am going to talk about is sort of wild cards to watch for. We talked about printers. It's a huge pain in the rear. I'm going to say it one more time. A huge pain in the rear. You have to configure them to the standard that is oftentimes challenging to get. You have to update firmware on them, and there's no tools to do it. So if you can, try and keep printers off your network. If you need to have a printer, you can connect it via USB cable, and that way it becomes a peripheral, like a monitor or a mouse. And you don't have to do it. That's kind of the get out of jail free card a little bit. Talked about the SaaS, and that needs to be FedRAMP. A bit about security protection assets. So security protection assets don't need to be FedRAMPed, even though you're expected to protect the security protection data as if it were CUI. But it's not CUI because it doesn't have a category. So it literally can't be CUI. So it doesn't need to be in a FedRAMP tool. But in order to fill in your SSP, you need to know what the security protection asset vendor will do for you. We call that inheritance. In order to get that, you need to have a CRM, a customer responsibility matrix. And many organizations are not used to these CRMs. So sometimes the only way that you can get a CRM is for the FedRAMP product. So it's a little bit like a catch-22. It doesn't need to be in FedRAMP, except it does in order to get a CRM. The test systems, the IoT and specialized assets, all of those kinds of things can be tricky. What we end up doing in general is, since we can't secure them, we logically isolate them. We put them off onto their own VLAN and behind a firewall boundary. So it's kind of like we put them behind another wall. So we've got a boundary outside, and then we have a boundary inside. That was really kind of what I was going to show up here, is the interior boundary. So it's like an enclave within the enclave. AI, there's been a lot of talk about that. AI can be super tricky to configure to 800.171. And I'm going to be straight with you. I've been working on this for a couple of months, kind of poking at it. I haven't figured it out yet. If you're going to submit CUI to an AI, the AI needs to be FedRAMPed, or you need to maintain it yourself. You also need to make sure that the data won't go out of your environment. So the best I've come up with so far is running your own AI, taking the large language model out from the internet, copying it in, but making sure that nothing can go out. And that's like 45 seconds of like an 8-hour conversation. Be real careful about AI. Unauthorized and authorized users in the same environment, we want to logically isolate. In order to do that, we have to add the access control lists. So if we're not going to enclave, if we're going to do everything in the same environment, our access control needs to be perfect. That's tricky. In my career, I've seen thousands of organizations. I've seen one that was properly access controlled. And in order to be CMMC compliant, you have to do that right. Supply chain, we talked about that. Virtual desktops. There's an interesting capability there for virtual desktops. If you use virtual desktops, then you don't have to do the physical security controls. So it makes it easier, especially for external people. And then is your MSP or MSSP a CSP? That's, again, really subtle. The bit there is it's very, very easy for a service provider to switch over into being a CSP, which means that they need to be FedRAMPed. And FedRAMP is a big, hairy, multi-million-dollar thing. So people complain about CMMC. FedRAMP is a much higher bar. Okay. So I'm out of time. So if you have any questions, please come find me. I also do want to mention that we are actually in about 2 weeks out in Washington, D.C. running what we call a CMMC liftoff. So we're getting organizations together and working through a lot of these kinds of items in an engineering sort of focus. So thinking about how are we not only going to engineer the computing environment, but how are we going to engineer the processes. So for anybody that's so inclined and feels like a trip to the East Coast, we've got that going on in 2 weeks, and I've got a flyer over back in the corner if you're interested. So thanks for your time and attention. Really appreciate it.